The following podcast discusses topics about mental health struggles and illnesses, including depression, anxiety, and self-harm. If you are sensitive to these topics or find them triggering, please continue listening with caution. If at any point the conversation is too much or you feel like you need to talk to someone, know that help is available. You can call the GBHWC 24-hour crisis hotline at 671-647-8833 or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255.
Welcome to Everything's Cherry, a podcast for casual conversations on all things mental health related.
On this podcast, we share personal stories, advice from professionals, and other musings on how everything and anything affects our mental health.
I'm Rizal.
And I'm CJ.
And today we're talking about therapy. Woo!
Yeah. Welcome. If you've made it this far, you have made it past May, and we are here in June now for our first kind of non-mental health awareness month episode. This is where we're going to start test running our 2 times a month, every second and fourth Wednesdays. So here we go. And today we're talking about therapy.
Yeah, just like our experiences with it, what it's kind of like getting a therapist here on Guam, what therapy is like, because I feel like, it's everybody kind of assumes that therapy is like, the episode of Freaky Friday where Jamie Lee Curtis is like, and how does that make you feel? Which it kind of is, right? But it's like, that's really all she's saying the entire time.
Right. Or it's the person on the chair laying down and the therapist, writing. I think the most recent example of therapy I can think about in a TV show was like Falcon and the Winter Soldier, where it's very like kind of gloomy, intense type thing, but also it's Marvel, so that tracks.
Right.
But yeah, it definitely, from my experiences of therapy, I don't feel like any therapy represented in media so far has been reflective of my experience. So I guess that's what we kind of wanted to talk about today. What our experiences with therapy is like, how we find the right therapist, and all that good stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Ooh, do you want to just kind of start? Do you want to? How do you want to?
I think we could just maybe we'll start then with, how do you find a therapist? Because maybe people listening might not even know that, which is valid. It's not always easy.
That is valid. How did you find yours?
So I have seen a slew of therapists. I realized earlier today when I was thinking about it, it's been 11 years since I was diagnosed with clinical depression for the first time in 2010, and the year is 2011. So it is over a decade officially. And so since in these 11 years, I have seen a slew of therapists. It definitely, but I can always, I'll start with Guam, where I started actually at the University of Guam. I transferred there after my first year of college, and that was still a time when my family and all of us really, like in my circle, we didn't really know how all of this worked. I was the first person to ever really be diagnosed with any kind of mental illness in my family at the time, or at least the first person who talked about it. So nobody really knew how to start. And so, I was taking like a psychology class at the University of Guam, and I was told about the ISA Psychological Center, which is a service that is free for students. And actually, it's not just students, but community members who don't have access to therapy on Guam can go to the ISA Psychological Center at the university. And so I just walked in, and I was like, I was so awkward. I just walked in, didn't know you had to make an appointment. I was like, I think I need to see a therapist. Dr. Twaddle, who is super awesome, walks out and was like, yeah, let's talk. And so, it starts like that. I mean, I'm sure now pandemic times and post-pandemic times, wherever you are listening to this, it might be a little different. You might have to email them to set that intake appointment, but basically, you go there, and based on you know, what you're going through, they'll match you with a student. So it's actually, yeah, a lot of the people at ISA are students who are working on their masters. And so, you know, this is their training grounds type thing. And yeah, so that's kind of how I started my first journey. And then it became more after I was done with UOG, it became more like going to my general physician and asking for a referral, and then being referred to different behavioral, behavioral centers, and going from there. And honestly, for me on Guam, because Guam is really limited with our choices, it really just became a thing of like, who does my insurance cover and who do I not know, because Guam's so small.
Right.
I definitely like had connections to half the therapists on the list that my insurance covered. So that is how, yeah, I kind of found my therapists. And what about you?
Yeah, it's so funny that you brought up ISA, because like my experience with them, like when I was trying to, and like I don't think that they're a bad resource at all. I think they're a great resource to have at UOG, for you, like you said, really for anybody, right, who doesn't really have like access to mental health care anywhere else. But like when I was going through my like first like really major episode of depression, like in college, during that final year of college that I mentioned in like the first episode, where I just couldn't write anything, I remember like I emailed them and I was just like, hi, I really think I need to talk to somebody. And they were like, okay, you have to call. And then I called and they were like, okay, you have to come in. I'm like, in order just to make an appointment. And I was just like, and I noped, right? Just because like I just wasn't in a position where I felt comfortable with that, you know? I was already like really struggling just with the idea of getting help, because, you know, at the time I was still like really wary about it, you know, and I was already feeling a kind of way, you know, and I was like really, really deep into my depression at the time, like super deep into it. And, you know, my anxiety at the same time was very high. So it was just like, I didn't see anybody for another like 2 years after I ran away and came back. And how I ended up finding that first therapist was like emailing. So like I just kind of like looked up on the interwebs, because like that's just kind of like how, that's the lowest like method of communication for my level of anxiety, right? That's just like the least stressful, was me like looking on the web, seeing who is available, and like emailing them. And like a couple of the people who I emailed at the time, they were like, they just couldn't take any more clients, or they were like fully booked up, or like they wouldn't have an appointment for like at least another month out. And so I ended up finding a clinic that was willing to take me and take my insurance. And that's how, and this was like in 2016, like early 2016. So that's where I found my first therapist. But the clinic did shut down, so that was fun. How, you know, a couple months in, so.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point when you were talking about availability, because I guess that is also what affected me, is like, yes, half the list I knew, or what, you know, had kind of known them because Guam is Guam, right? And then maybe a quarter of the list I couldn't even get into because they're so booked.
Yeah.
And I think that's something really important to talk about, like, especially as we move towards this time where we are trying to encourage people to seek therapy and be more open about it. Like, do we even have enough therapists to handle the influx? And so that's definitely something to think about. But I get what you're saying, though, about how when there's just so many barriers to it, sometimes you're just like, nope, because like when you think about it, there's the barrier already of like therapy still has a stigma surrounding it, especially at the time when we were looking into therapists for the first time. And then I don't know about you, but for me, like any kind of medical appointments just give me anxiety to begin with, you know, whether it's like a dentist appointment. So there's already so many blocks But I think, I guess that's a good question. Like, if someone's here listening to this and they're trying to think about making their therapy appointment for the first time, but they're running into the same roadblocks we did, what advice would we give to them?
Good question. Man, I don't know. What would you say? I mean, like, my general thing is like, just keep trying, right, to find someone, and maybe like have somebody that you can safely like talk to. Like, if you feel like, you're in a position where it's becoming unsafe to you, like have some, like, see if you can find a personal support system while you wait.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that will help a lot while you're trying to figure out, find somebody to talk to, right? I mean, we don't want it to come to an emergency situation, obviously, right? Where you're waiting so long that it eventually does become an emergency. But like, it's really hard to say, right? When you don't know if people are going to be available when you need it.
Mm-hmm. And definitely, I think, building off of that, having a person, I think having accountability and a support system, because I know for me, because I'm not going to lie and say that in the 11 years dealing with depression, I have consistently seen a therapist. Like, I have had long periods of time where I should definitely have been seeing someone, but just kept putting it off for whatever reason. And this is the first time in a while that I am consistently seeing a therapist. But even finding her, my current therapist, I had to have someone keep me accountable to be like, make your appointment. Like, I know you know, and someone, so maybe find that person. I think would be find a person who you trust that can keep you accountable, in a safe way, not pressuring you, but just gently reminding you, like, hey, Rizal, have you made your appointment yet? Do you need my help calling places? Like, find that person. And if you're a person who already sees a therapist, or therapy is just not what you're looking for, maybe you can be that person for someone else who is trying to search for a therapist, because it is hard. It's not easy to be vulnerable, and then it's not easy to schedule, that time.
Yeah, that's a good point, because like I remember probably one of my favorite people that I have seen, my husband was the one who helped me find her, because I was just like, I need to see someone right now, but I am not sure that I can figure out a person or something like that by myself, right? Because like you said, like you could end up like putting it off, but he was really helpful and helping me to be accountable for that, basically, helping me find her and make that appointment, and like sometimes even being the one to talk to her for me to make appointments. That helped me a lot.
Yeah, I think that's great. And if you don't have that person in your life, you can DM us. And I'm terrible at making appointments for myself, but I'm really good at making appointments for other people. So
I feel like that's the case. we help ourselves so little sometimes.
Right.
But we're here for you.
Yeah. And just as a note, as Rizal mentioned about emergencies, like realistically, I know it's been a year or two since I've seen a therapist on Guam, but realistically, from what I remember, I would make an appointment and like I wouldn't be able to be seen for another month. So if you are in an emergency situation and things are still kind of hard to book, don't forget that the resources, we mentioned at the beginning and the end, the hotlines, they are there for that reason.
The hotlines up here.
Yeah. So that is just our little plug there. I know we're usually doing it at the beginning and the end, but yeah, it's not easy. And sometimes you really need that person right away.
I remember there was this one person, like, I called and they were just like, she's not open. Like, it was like my first time scheduling with this person, and I couldn't see her for a month, right? Like, this was like a person that I was trying to find a new therapist at the time. And then I saw her that month and she's like, I'm not going to be able to see you for another month. And I'm just like, I can't do this.
Yeah.
There's no way I can do this.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you do need immediate help, we do recommend, those resources because it can be tough.
Yeah, and of course, if I don't think that's just an issue with Guam. I know that here I have to book my therapist in advance, to make sure that I get the slot I want. It's just, therapists are in high demand, which is a good thing. But so if you're searching for a therapist for the first time, it can be very disheartening to go through these experiences, but just know that the payoff is really worth it. It'll be it might be a struggle at first, or you might be one of those people who is able to get in and squeeze themselves in and you have a really good time. But either way, don't let the process discourage you, and keep pushing. And so when you do take that step, I guess the next thing is like, what does therapy actually look like? Right?
Yeah. I don't know. Like, I feel like whenever I start a new therapist, the beginning is kind of the same, where they kind of want to know a lot more about you. So I always end up like talking about like my family history to help kind of define the person who I've become, which later bleeds into like where I am now. But like I feel like the first couple sessions are always just like, they ask you, like, in my experience, like, they've asked me about, like, my family a lot of the times. Partially because, like, I always mentioned that I've had a family history of mental illnesses. So it kind of comes up, right? But also, like, usually I feel like when you kind of come in, they ask you what you want to talk about. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the answer is, I don't know, but then everything kind of falls out of you.
All the time.
So it's really interesting, It's like, I feel like it's like when you kind of write in your journal and you're like, I don't know what to write about today. And then like you just start rambling. That's what I always feel like therapy kind of is, like when it's just like when you're just talking, you know?
Let me tell you, every time I come into therapy thinking I don't really have much to talk about today is like the therapy session where I am in tears the entire time. And I know we talked about this in Joyce's episode, but like I said, I cry all the time, and I cry every single therapy session, which isn't a bad thing.
Right.
So I think for me, with my experience, it actually it's interesting because, again, 11 years of being depressed, I guess. Being a person with depression. Depression does not define me, but it is a part of me. So living with depression for 11 years, I've definitely have been into therapy sessions in different parts of my life. And so I think for me in the beginning, it was a lot of like learning how to cope, right? Yeah. And of course, I'm sure the intro will give this trigger warning that I'm about to talk about. But I dealt with self-harm very early on in my young adult life, and so my early therapy sessions were all about talking about and figuring out the root of like why this was a thing in my life and what things I could do to cope with it. What alternatives I had. Things like playing my guitar instead when I had those feelings, and just different things. So that's what it was like at first. And then as I got older and self-harm was less of a concern and just more of like coping, then it became more about like digging deep into why I had these feelings. And therapy is where I learned for the first time when I was like in my mid-20s that I did not know how to process anger. And that it's the first time I learned that anger is an okay feeling, and realizing like I was not taught that. I was taught that it's never okay to be angry. And and then now therapy for me is just every week, I only go like every other week, but every other week it's a safe space that I can go to process the things that have happened in the last 2 weeks. And it's the place where I can still identify things like, why am I feeling this way? And how can we fix it? So
Right.
therapy can be so much things, but I think the most important thing to note is like it's gonna be what you need it to be. If you're seeing the right therapist, it's yeah, it the right therapist is going to make sure that the therapy session is serving you. And
Right.
yeah, and my therapist said something really great the other day. She was like, you know, I'm here to serve you as my client. So you tell me what you need. And like, yeah, I think my therapist can tell me that because I've been to therapy so many times. So again, you can come in not knowing what you need because they're the professionals who will help get you there.
Yeah. And like when you kind of like go through it, after some time, you do kind of figure out what you do need. You know, like the last time that I had seen somebody, I had kind of gone in with a notebook of like, look, these are my goals. This is what I'm trying to figure out right now. Can you help me? You know what I mean? Because I think, I mean, it's not like you're an expert at yourself. I don't think you're ever really going to be. But like after you've been through it for a while, like you have a clearer idea of like what the issue exactly is that you're struggling with, even if you don't necessarily know the answer to it. You bring up a good point though, because like about coping, I never really learned how to cope either. That I did discover in therapy. When I had seen my first therapist, she had mentioned to me, you are a person who has like high coping skills, not in like the way that I can cope with things properly, but that like my anxiety, I've just kind of learned to live with it, and therefore when it escalated, I never learned how to deal with it, basically, is what happened. So like when I had that first like really major episode of depression where again I just could not, and it just like because of it my anxiety was just like all the way up. You know, first of all, I was still trying to figure out what to do with myself while I was struggling with depression. Second of all, my anxiety was at a level that I was not familiar with. And so I was just like, I don't know what to do. And then so like as I was like kind of telling her my journey with myself, she was like, so basically you've been coping with all of this and just not realizing it. So now we have to figure out how to make you realize what's happening and how we can get you to cope with it in a healthy way. Because like, opposite of you, I was very angry growing up. Very angry because like I was surrounded by anger all of the time. And so like I thought that was like just a normal way to process things, and it was super toxic. I was like that toxic friend. Like God bless all of the friends I still have today, because like even though like I would have moved heaven and earth for all of them, right, growing up, I still had a lot of like really bad habits, right, because of the way that I never really learned how to like process my emotions or talk about my emotions like in a healthy and productive way, in a way that wasn't like harming other people, right? So like it's just, what is the point that I'm getting at here? I don't know. But yeah, it really I think that a lot of it is in general like with, I think people our age, is that a lot of us don't really know how to cope, and that's kind of something that we have to learn how to do in a way that is productive for ourselves, in a way that's healthy for us, in a way that's safe for ourselves and other people, which I think is a good skill. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, and that is what therapy is for.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's interesting.
I will say that, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
No, I was just gonna say that like what I really do enjoy with one of my favorite therapists was that like we really, because at that point I was like kind of like already mid into my like journey with therapy. Like I'd already seen people before, and like I was kind of familiar with what I wanted out of, you know, my experiences with this person, was like cognitive behavioral therapy. So CBT is a type of psychotherapeutic treatment that helps people learn how to identify and change destructive or disturbing thought patterns that have a negative influence on behavior and emotions. So basically, it's kind of a way to shift the way that you think about yourself and the way that you react, right? And that was kind of like what I had gone in for, because again, like immediately out of habit, a lot of the times my initial means of processing things is to be angry, right? Even if I'm not being outwardly showing it, right? Just in my head, like immediately I get very upset and like just angry and just aggravated, right, when things happen sometimes, especially if it's a recurring issue. And so at this time, I was really struggling with some things, and I needed somebody to help me kind of like turn it around in a way that like I wasn't like just constantly like, poisoning myself with my anger, because it was starting to like kind of destroy my mental health at the time, right? And so I had asked for like CBT exercises so that like where it was like something that she had told me was like, you can't control how other people react to you, right? You can only, like, the only thing you really have control over is like yourself and how you process everything. And so like she was trying to help guide me in a way where I wasn't destroying myself in my anger every single time I was getting upset, And it was like, for example, one of the situations was like if somebody had said something to me, right, where it felt like I was constantly fighting this person, right, over something, right, because it felt like this person wasn't listening to me, right. She did this, like one of the exercises that we would do is like she would kind of like, how do I explain this? And this person would, argue back with me about this thing, and I felt like I wasn't being heard. And so she kind of like did this in a way where she was like, well, let's just kind of shift our thoughts and like, why do you think this person might be reacting to you this way, right? And in not in a way to like to justify this other person's behavior, right? But just to kind of like maybe make myself not so angry at everybody involved. Do you know what I mean? Does that make any sense?
No, it does.
Because so yeah, there was also a lot of like me pretending to be me talking to myself. Right. Which was real fun, you know what I mean? Like, just like me, I would be like on the couch and like, she would be like, so say this to yourself, right? And so I would say it, and then she would be like, okay, now if you were you talking to yourself, and she would have me move and face the other direction and be like, now what would you say to yourself? Yeah. And so that was like super helpful, right? Because like a lot of the times, like when people come to us for advice, right, like we're so good at like being non-judgmental with other people and like giving them like tools to kind of like help them process things, but we were so bad at doing that with ourselves. Yep. And so she was forcing me to do it with myself.
Yeah. No, I actually have a very similar experience with my current therapist, because a lot of what we're trying to work on now that I'm an adult, and I very much in a different place from when I first started seeing a therapist, is really now getting into the hard stuff, but really the root of why I feel this way, why I just have a lot of negative self-talk and, self-hate. And so a lot of times what my therapist will do, she'll be like, I'll say something about myself. And she was like, would you say that to a friend? And I'm like, you're right. I would not. And so that, sometimes you just need someone who could just be like, well, would you really, and that is what a therapist could be. And she even like actually issues me. She doesn't like it when I call it homework, because she's like, you need to stop making things just part of your to-do list, because you can't just do things just so you could check it off the list. And I was like, you caught me. But she gives me
my gosh.
because basically my therapist, when we started, she would give me these different, like, assignments is what my head would call it, but really just encouragement to do things, like stop saying bad things about yourself, or talk to your friends about this. Talk to your friends about this. And I would like make it a part of my to-do list, and she totally caught me, and she was like, no, CJ, we're not trying to give you more work. Because that's, we're not trying to make you more stressed and giving you assignments. And I was like, okay. And so, therapy can be so much things. Sometimes it's that. And, sometimes it's literally just talking about your day to someone who isn't someone in your life, someone who is an objective observer who can understand. Like, I've even been able to like go to a therapist and be like, oh, today was like I had something in mind of what I wanted to talk about, but I end up just crying the whole time because I had got into a fight with a partner, and that's what therapy can be sometimes. So it's just so much. It's a world of opportunity. I see you pulled out a journal. You have thoughts to share?
I love the homework. I love it when like they give me worksheets and like, okay, let's just like over the next week, if you ever have a moment, just do this, like if you're feeling away, just do this. And so I have this like journal of like, right, with this like little worksheet I was given a couple years ago.
If you're not watching the visual pod,
to really,
I just have to say, I'm pretty sure I gave you that journal.
You did. You gave this to me. You did. And like there's this like worksheet of like so it's basically this whole thing where it's like, what is this thing that you're frustrated with? What are the things that you're thinking? How are you feeling? And like, are all of these thoughts that you're having about yourself or your situation necessarily true?
Ooh.
Yeah. And how is this affecting you so it's like kind of like a bunch of questions, right? Where like if I'm in a situation where I'm like really upset with myself or really stressed, right? Like this one where I was like really stressed out about breastfeeding, right? And like all the feelings that I was having, right, about like eventually having to wean, or like eventually like giving my kid a bottle, right? Right, because that makes you feel a way, like even if you don't mean it to be, like there's like this kind of like little naggy part in the back of your mind when you're breastfeeding. I feel like when your kid isn't feeding from you, like you're like, oh, my baby doesn't need me anymore, right? And so that was something that I was struggling with, and like this worksheet helped me kind of like work through that. Like, is it true that my baby doesn't need me anymore if she's not like breastfeeding? How is it affecting me if I continue to believe that these feelings, right? Like, what can you do better? What is a more positive thought that you can think of instead, right? How are other ways that this statement is not true? You know what I mean? And so like having like, I don't know, is this like a tool I should not be sharing?
No. I mean, definitely consult with your therapist, but I think that's like a great tool. Yeah.
It helps me a lot because I do that, also with like the negative self-talk, and like having the worksheets and like being given these tools to like really help me turn my own thoughts around has been just so helpful for me as a person, right? And like, oh yeah.
And I know it might be easy to be like, well, I can get that off the internet or off a podcast from these two girls rambling. Why do I need to take the time to see a therapist? And the answer is because it's not always going to, things aren't always going to be the right thing for you. And when you have a dedicated therapist, like they're going to give you the best thing that is best for you if you have a good therapist. And, I kind of wanted to, I feel like we gave a pretty good picture of what therapy can kind of look like. And I'm sorry that the answer is it could look like anything, essentially.
Right.
But I think, a question comes to mind on like, it seems like you have a similar experience with me where you haven't just had one therapist, right?
Right.
So what was it like finding the right therapist for you?
I think it was kind of, it's hard, right? Because like not everybody is gonna click with you, you know. Sometimes like it feels like something's not necessarily working, and a person is not giving you what you need. And sometimes like after a period of time, it might be like, well, I don't know if I can keep seeing this person anymore. And so like it's hard, right? Because then you have to figure out how do you move on from that person, right? And by the way, like your therapist, like you don't have to commit to somebody if they aren't working. You know what I mean? Don't feel obligated to stay just because, right? You need to do what is best for you because you know, that's what they're there for. If it's not working for you, then it's not working for you, and there's just nothing that you can really do about it, right?
And I'm really glad you said that because nobody told me that. Like I thought
Right.
if the therapist wasn't working for me, then I was the problem, you know?
Right.
And yeah, no one ever told me that. It was like, no, there's different therapists for everyone. And it's okay if the first 3 or 4 or 5 don't work for you. There will be someone who will work for you. And if you get in a situation where you're not vibing, it don't always think it's you that's the problem.
Right. And I know that can feel really discouraging that it's not going to fit right away. Sometimes we get really lucky and like the first person we talk to is that person for us, right? But you know, it's worth it to find the person who works for you, you know? Like there were people who I sat down with and immediately I'm like, this is not going to work, you know? And so like that can be super discouraging, but like when you find that it's like a relationship, right? It's like when you date other people, right? It's like any other relationship you have, except you're paying for your time, right? Where you might have to look around for a while before you find somebody who really works, and when you do, it's gonna be worth it. I swear it's gonna be worth it.
And then if you're sitting here wondering, how do I know if it's the right person for me? And honestly, I don't think we're the people to answer that. I think you are the person who will answer that when you get there. And I just want to grab onto something Rizal mentioned really briefly about, you know, paying for someone's time. Now, if you're listening to this and therapy might not be accessible to you because you don't have health insurance, or, you know, a lot of therapy can be cost prohibitive because it is expensive.
It's true.
You know, we talked about the ISA Psychological Center earlier on Guam. If you're on Guam, we also have Guam Behavioral Health and Wellness Center. Just know that there are going to be resources for you no matter where you are in your life. And I, you know, obviously it's a whole conversation for a different type of podcast. Like I wish therapy was free for everyone in the United States of America. It's not right now, but just know that there are free resources out there. So definitely.
Question.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, definitely just keep looking. They're there. You had a question?
I do. Like, just want to tack on. Yeah, it's been really hard for me also because, like, you know, when I got off my parents' insurance, I didn't have insurance because, like, ma'am, sir, I am like freelance and I was working for nonprofits. I did not have health insurance without my parents. Right. So that was like a struggle for me, right? Trying to find somebody like when I eventually, you know, and like eventually getting on insurance. That was such a hard time trying to figure it out. I really do wish we had free mental health care, like just everybody, you know.
Right.
It's unfortunate. But sorry, going back to the question that I had, have you ever tried one of those apps? Because I get like recommended all the time, like these counseling apps. Do you know anybody who has tried them?
I don't know. I almost did this pandemic because I was like, I want to just find a therapist that I could permanently see virtually because, right, if you're tuning in and you know me, I'm from I'm from Guam, but I'm currently living in Nashville, and like I still don't like to drive. So I did get very close, but my insurance was like, no, we're not going to cover that. So I did just find a therapist who was willing to meet with me, like basically on Zoom, but not really Zoom, just online webcam type things. So no, I have not tried one of those things, but I know they're kind of expensive though, which is why I wouldn't really do it without my insurance covering it.
Do insurances cover it? I have a lot, like, I'm just very curious about them. Not like, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm not saying that I'm going to do it. I'm just curious because I don't know if anybody has been like thinking about it. If anybody out there has any experiences with any of those like apps or like online counseling services, drop a comment. We want to know.
Yeah, I think some insurances do cover it because it was something I was able to look into. It wasn't like,
I see.
oh, for sure we accept no medical insurance. It was like, check to see if yours covers it type thing. I'm sure like if you're on Guam, though, I don't know how much our insurance covers like stateside or online features.
Right.
But I mean, I guess if those things are, if you find like the legit ones, it would be really beneficial to have someone who you could talk to at any time. Of course, that is always going to be the barrier you have with just a therapist because they're not going to be on call, right?
Right.
Which...
Yeah.
Sometimes I wish they were, but of course they have their lives. They are people too. We love you, therapists. Thank you for doing the work you do.
Yeah. I love the eye contact. That's why I could never do an app.
That's
it's really
true.
easy for me to put my phone down,
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too because I'm here. I've looked into some therapists here who are like, no, after the pandemic, I'm not going to continue the video call thing because I like to see my client in person because body language says a lot.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just, but if going to a therapy place isn't accessible for you, I think now's a really great time to search for therapists and be like, hey, you did do video calls during the pandemic, is this something you could do for me? Because even living on Guam, like, that was a huge barrier for me. If I had to like drive to therapy, I would find every which way to convince myself not to go. And so it's pretty hard to be like, I'm just not gonna go when all you need to do is pop on your camera now. So
yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like we've covered quite a bit, what therapy looks like, how to find the right therapist, all that good stuff. Is there any other thoughts you have about therapy?
I don't think so. I feel like we just kind of rambled a lot, which is, I hope that whoever's listening takes something away from it. I mean, if you need help trying to figure out what to do, if you're looking for a therapist, feel free to reach out. We're here for you. And if you have any other questions, specific questions, we're here to answer them. We're going to try not to make this run too long because the last one, or well, not the last one of like the third episode ran super long. So we're going to try and keep it pretty short.
And I did want to add to you kind of talking about therapy is that if you're curious, therapy is different from psychiatry, and maybe this will be an episode, maybe we'll have a psychiatrist involved, but something that was really important to my healing process for the first few years of my early adulthood was combining therapy and psychiatry. So I saw a psychiatrist one week, and then the other week I saw a therapist. And because most of the time, psychiatrists are the ones who are the actual like doctors that prescribe you medicine.
Right.
And therapists are the counselors. So if you think that maybe talking about medication is the right step for you, definitely you would want to also look into psychiatry as well. Because at least back home on Guam, I know that was a big thing, always wanting to see both your psychiatrist and your therapist on a regular basis because they would work together, to if that was the best plan for your healing. Yeah, and I'm sure we'll dig deeper.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I remember when the first time I was on medication, I had to, my therapist, was working with an MD, and so, I had to go, in order to be prescribed my medication, I had to, go and see the MD, and, we kind of, talked it through, and then before she prescribed something, because your therapist cannot, right?
Right. Yeah, so that is a very important distinction to make, and if you all want to hear more about psychiatry and medication, we'd be happy to talk. Both of us have been very open about the fact that we have both at some point been on medication for our mental health, which there's totally no shame in that.
Right. And I'm willing to go back on medication if I ever needed it again.
Yeah, same. It took a while for me to be able to say that. Same, I would be willing to, but definitely, I understand that sometimes it might need to be the right step, and that's okay.
Right.
So, I hope that was helpful.
Yeah.
And yeah, so again, this is the first episode that we're launching post-May. Tune in for more, and yeah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks. Bye.
Special thanks to Andrew Speed for sound editing, mixing, and creating our intro music. New episodes of Everything's Cherry will be available on the second and fourth Wednesdays of every month. Please be sure to tune in and listen, or find our visual podcasts available on YouTube. Don't forget to find and follow us on Instagram at Everything's Cherry Guam. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, send us a DM, email us, or send us a voice message on Anchor. Our aim with this podcast is to have important conversations about mental health, but we understand that the feelings brought upon through this exploration may sometimes linger. If you are looking for support and healing surrounding your experiences, the following resources are available and accessible for you. There's the Guam Behavioral Health and Wellness Center 24-hour crisis hotline at 647-8833, or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK or 1-800-273-8255. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.